Good afternoon, and welcome to the launch of Onward's Breaking Blue project. I'm Fazan Tahir, owner of the Tahir Group, one of the UK's leading hospitality companies. We host dozens of franchises for brands such as KFC and Starbucks. As well as a businessman, I'm also deeply interested in the future of the Conservative Party and the centre-right. It's very important to me that after such a heavy defeat, that the loss is properly examined. I've therefore been delighted to collaborate with Onward on the Breaking Blue project. Over the last 6 months, we've conducted huge amounts of research through polling and focus groups across the country to get to the roots of what happened in July. As the party is picking its new leader, I hope they will take the time to read, digest, and understand how we lost the election so badly. Only by properly understanding the loss can we understand the route back. The conclusions are pretty stark, and I'm going to hand over to Seb and the team to explain before we begin the debate. But I wanted to thank everyone at Onward, Focal Data, and JL Partners for their work on this project. And thank you all for coming here today to appreciate this important piece of work.
Thank you very much, Fazan, and thank you all for coming to the second Onward Fringe event of Conservative Party Conference. I'm Sebastian Payne, Director of Onward, and we're here in our marquee for the rest of the week if it doesn't blow or wash away in the Birmingham weather. And this is one of the most important panels we'll be doing at the conference because this is the launch of our Breaking Blue project. Now, Onward has done election studies and analysis before, but this one is all the more important because, as I think you're all aware, we lost the election, and we lost the election very badly, in fact. And there's a lot of people who are saying, well, in fact, it could just be fine. We could come back before you know it, and the wheel of politics will turn. And we are here to say that is absolutely not the case at all, that the loss in July 2024 was catastrophically bad. It was the worst loss in a century, and the Conservative Party is going to have to do some pretty radical things if it wants to get back into power in 5 years' time. So we are here to set out the findings from Breaking Blue. The full report is a nice 150 pages with 106 graphs, as I discovered today. So if you want to read that whole thing over your Ovaltine tonight, then please do. But we'll be having a quick run through of it here before hearing from two of the most important voices in the Conservative Party about their reflections on the campaign and crucially where it goes next. So on the panel, we have on my far left, not politically, is James Kanagasorian, who is Chief Research Officer at Focal Data. He has been the polling guru behind Breaking Blue, and he's also a member of Onward's Advisory Board. Just a bit further to my left, we have Katie Lamb, who is the newly elected MP for the Weald of Kent and was previously a special advisor to the Home Secretary and had a career in the private sector as well. To my right, needs no introduction, is the Right Honourable Grant Shapps, who has been one of the most energetic, enthusiastic and prominent faces in the Conservative Party over the past 14 years. He was the Defence Secretary and the MP for Welwyn Hatfield, and I believe is launching a new project as well, which we might touch upon as well at this conference, Conservatives Together. And then on my far right as well, we have Dr. Tom Lubbock from JL Partners. JL Partners conducted the focus groups, and they had the joys of doing 12 focus groups throughout the election campaign from all the glamorous spots across the country that I think we lost every single seat, which means that they were targeted very well for the report. So I'm going to hand over to James, who's going to rattle through, and this is a bit like a Year 9 chemistry presentation where you have the slides in front of you as well. So if you can't see the screen or you want to take home a signed souvenir, they're there with you, but they'll be on the screen as well. So James, do you want to kick us off and tell us just how bad the situation is?
Thanks, Seb. I'm not sure about your chemistry lessons, but mine didn't include having beer in the front row. But,
it was a state school, don't worry.
So we're just going to crack on with 5 slides about how bad the election defeat was, and then 5 slides about the future. I think the first 5 we'll go through quite quickly because I think people understand the scale of the defeat. So this really is kind of a once-in-a-century loss. A lot of people's baseline for the election result was that it would match 1997. Certainly at the local elections, that was basically where this general election was headed. So the modelling that was done basically in and around the locals suggested that the Conservatives were on course for around 140 to 160 seats. That didn't eventuate. They obviously got 121 seats and 23.7% of the vote, which is nearly 6 points lower than what John Major got in 1997. So the good news doesn't arrive for quite some time. So the next slide. One of the pleasures of this report, and it was a really stellar team across multiple different companies and multiple different lots of people, was the ability to go back to 1986 and basically model the US electorate by segment. This involved half a year's worth of work and a whole roster of PhD data scientists. And for me, it was a couple of things that were really interesting. First of all, the Conservative Party has had many different flavours across time. For those of you who want to look at the report across 1986, each time it's been elected, it has done so on the basis of a very different electorate and very different coalition. So I think that's worth bearing in mind. The second thing is, a lot of these groups move together. We call that covariance, which is that basically people are more similar to each other than you might think. What moves their political opinion, what makes them believe that a government is incompetent, can often be very similar about delivery of public services and not sticking to your word and infighting. So I think that's one of the key things that comes out from this. The next slide, if we can just move to that, is really giving the context since 2020, which was really the story of 2020 all the way to 2024 was of a balloon basically becoming deflated. And we saw that was punctuated by a couple of things. The most important were really the kind of vaccine uptake, which led to a kind of temporary boost for the Conservative Party and the government, but Partygate, and then clearly the mini budget, which was a political catastrophe from a polling perspective at least. And since then, that then led to a structural decline. We were headed towards a 1997 defeat, and then of course the emergence of Reform and Nigel Farage then changed that structurally into something that was an even heavier defeat. The next slide makes even clearer, and we've asked here, this is across all voters who voted in 2024, and it's very, very clear that a bad situation was then made worse by campaign blunders in terms of D-Day, in terms of the structural change of Nigel Farage, in terms of the betting scandal. So I promised you that I'd go through the bad quickly so that we can move forward to understand where this leaves us. So the next slide, I think, is the last on the bad, which is what were the biggest Conservative failures across collectively voters who had voted at some point in 2015, 17 and 19. And I think what was very interesting is immigration came up basically twice as the top two. And I think there's no escaping that, and it's going to be a topic that's discussed at length throughout this. And I think, interestingly, getting rid of Boris, it's an interesting polling fact. We kept it in there, and I think that's worth just also reflecting on. But clearly, the Conservative Party is not in government, so there's a clear question of what comes next. And just so we're clear, this is very much from a polling, targeting, electorate analysis perspective. So the very, very easy to read 2x2 slide with lots of dots is what's next. But I want to explain the story behind it rather than I'm currently looking at about 60 people squinting, looking quite confused.
It's in front of you as well, again.
So let me describe the story of what we've done. So this is really the analytical centerpiece of the report. And it's around something what we call super demographics, which sounds like a terrible band from the 1980s, I know. But what it's trying to describe is that the story of the Conservative Party losing vote share, being down 19.9%, was actually a function of obviously losing political voting intention to a huge number of different areas and parties. I think it lost around 23% to Reform, it lost 7% to the Liberal Democrats, 13% to the Labour Party, and around 3% to the Green Party. You'll notice there the aggregate left and right defections were quite similar. But one of the things that really struck me was instead of that being a story of voters going everywhere for very different reasons, what the analysis actually showed is that the people who left the Conservative Party, its vote share effectively halved, were quite similar but went in very different directions. And this is why we call them the super demographics. What are super demographics? They're basically individual level markers of a person that indicate a much higher propensity to have joined the party since 2001 and then left in one go in 2024. In other words, there are people who were part of the story of the Conservative Party increasing its vote share at 6 elections in a row from 2001 and then all going in one go. And what we see actually is that people who have one of those markers are very likely to have 2, 3, 4 or 5. And actually, if you put them all together, what you basically have an index of are people who are very conservative leaning, very likely to vote Conservative, but all decided to leave the party in one go, which is why the election result was so catastrophic. So what are these markers? The most obvious one is Leave voters, but again, it's people who are 65 to 74, but it's not as simple as age. It's also people who own their own home outright. It's also people who, what advertisers is called C2, which is a technical term for skilled working class. Now, we think of these as separate categories, but actually many of these overlap it to a huge degree. And the next slide, as soon as you look at that overlap, what you begin to see is that this basically describes the story of the Conservative Party since 2001. This is how it put on votes in 6 elections in a row and then lost them all in one go in 2024. So the way to read this graph, really, the easiest way is to look, I see a lot of squinting, so I'm going to turn to storytelling, which is that if you look at the graph that says 5+, that is effectively people who have 5 or more markers of the super demographics that I've just described. And you can see that the vote share rose from around 45-50% in 2015, and it was as low as 50%. 45% before then rose to 80% by the time we got to the 2019 election. In other words, the increase in the vote share of the Conservative Party over time is not distributed evenly at all. It's amongst a certain group. This is all just a very fancy way of describing the fact that the Conservatives squarely focused on a group of people, and actually the story of the 2015, 17 and 19 elections are not that different. So a lot of the Liberal Democrats that fell to the party in 2015 had these markers. A lot of the gains that Theresa made, 4 to 5%, also had these markers. A lot of the gains that Boris Johnson made also had these markers. And amongst all of those, what we call newly loyal people, they all lost their faith in one go. Now, what happens going forward? The next slide, I think, should describe that a bit more efficiently. So one of the counterintuitive things that came out from the report was actually the people that had defected to the Liberal Democrats and the Reform Party were more similar to each other than defectors to the Labour Party. They shared many more features in terms of their views, what they thought about policy, their demographics, and where they are. And that can be quite counterintuitive because, of course, the Liberal Democrats, with now over 70 seats, hold quite distinct clutch of seats that basically at the Waterloo train out of London, and then a kind of conurbation around the M25 going west. But functionally, the voters that switched in those seats are very, very similar to the votes that were lost to Reform. And what we see in the report, and again, as Seb's describes 106 graphs, go into some detail, the defectors that the Conservatives lost to Labour look very different. They'll be a lot harder to win. The breach of trust there was in some ways even more catastrophic, particularly on public services. And I think that again, this is about staging posts. The Conservative Party, when it wins, does so incrementally, and to rebuild something will take time. Just to kind of finish up, really, there's only 2 more slides. So the next slide is really about what would increase the likelihood of voters voting Conservative the next election. What we've done here is examine the universe of people that have voted Conservative at any point in 2015. Again, very similar features to what people thought went wrong, also point a picture about what should happen in the future. So the first is around stricter immigration controls. I mean, for those, the data makes even clearer every time you look at it, the degree and the importance of immigration control. But again, there's another meta theme here that's quite important, which is about cakeism. So the Conservative people, Conservative-orientated people, because it's worth remembering that over 50% of the country has at some point voted Conservative in the recent history, is they want things that might be slightly mutually exclusive. Because you've got here lower taxes on low to middle income people. We've got reduction of immigration. We've also got competency. We've also got people who want a more streamlined state in some of the polling, but actually a lot of our polling show that's not always the case. But actually, functionally on the economy, there's a lot of things that the Conservative Party will have to work its way out. Because what we can see here is that a lot of voters want things that don't quite tally up with each other and are going to be quite hard to deliver all at the same time. And for me, that's the task of organisations like Onward and the rest of the kind of centre-right ecosystem, is really parsing and trying to understand that, because cakeism lasted for one election and then became undone very quickly. And the last thing I would say is, what should the Conservative Party not be doing? And this is quite an interesting one. The least popular option was to basically a deal with Nigel Farage, which I thought was very interesting and not what I expected at all from the data that came out. And again, it's worth remembering, this is the universe of Conservative voters since 2015 and 17, so it does include, of course, people who have defected from the Conservative Party. But also, structurally, the Conservative universe of people also quite socially conservative. So you can see there from those options, people want that shut down. So just to kind of summarise, our 150-page report and 106 graphs. the performance was exceptionally bad at the general election, but it was bad in a very particular and very unintuitive way. And therefore, the path back can uniquely focus, I think, on these voters of the super demographics who actually share a lot of values, even though they occupy very different geographic areas. And yeah, it's been a pleasure. And I think I'm going to hand over to Tom now to go through some of the qual.
Thanks so much, James. I think I should just say thanks to Seb, everyone at Onward, and all their backers for making this work possible. It's extremely important work, and it comes at a really, really important time for the party. Let's have the next slide. So we, as Seb said, we actually did 13 focus groups. There are 24 hours of focus group footage. If you wanted to sit down and spend 24 of your hours watching focus groups from across this campaign, it would be a painful watch, I can tell you, because I've seen them all. And I just wanted to pull out 2 points that really surprised me, but that came through across the piece. So we obviously went to different seats, spoke to different kinds of voters, but as James was pulling out there in the slides, there are some real commonalities between these voters, and they point to the way forward. I'll start with these points about Keir Starmer, which might seem like a weird place to start, but I think it emphasises the scale of the defeat. So there are 2 quotes here from 2 of our focus group participants. The first is, remember, these were people who were about to vote Labour in the election. Labour's just as bad. I can't stand Keir Starmer. You're going to get the same thing, whoever gets in. And the other one is, Labour are not that different to the Conservatives. I mean, what choice do we have, though? And this was a sentiment that we got across the country. We spoke to lots and lots of voters who were about to vote Labour and felt this way about Keir Starmer and the Labour Party. And really, you can look at that in a glass half full or a glass half empty way. The glass half empty way is that we went down to a 122 seat defeat to a party that was really not that well liked by the country, which really just says that, you know, to me, that the scale of the defeat is perhaps even greater than the number of seats would suggest. But obviously the glass half full view is that, you know, and it has played out over the last few weeks, that there is a way back. The Conservative Party can come back and win in 2029, 2028, because Labour are not that popular amongst this group of voters. And I think that is really the most positive thing to come out of this research, is that there is no love out there for the Labour Party, and that there is a huge opportunity for whoever becomes leader. Now, what should they do? Let's look on the next slide. This was another really clear sentiment that came out across different groups, different parts of the country. So two quotes here. For me, it was when it was one leader out, one leader in, one leader out, one leader in, scandal here, scandal there. And then the second quote, it just shows how corrupt they all are. They want to be part of the elite, the money people. They're not interested in us. And really, what we heard in every single group we did is that the Conservative brand, and think of it as a brand rather than kind of as a group of policies or a group of people, it's a brand like Sainsbury's, Tesco, Aldi. It's incredibly tarnished. Whatever you think the cause of it was, and the report really clearly sets out those causes, but we sit at a point where the brand is incredibly tarnished, and to fix that, you need a clean start, something which signifies to these voters here, who were Conservative voters in the past, that these things are of the past rather than of the future. The new Conservative Party is something very different. It's the trick Keir Starmer pulled off so effectively against a much easier backdrop of Jeremy Corbyn, but it's the trick that the new leader is going to have to pull if they want to win in the next election.
Thank you very much. And on that, well, actually quite hopeful note, we'll bring in our 2 MPs here. And I think those headlines to bring together what Tom and James said, that yes, it is bad, but there is a clear way back in 5 years if the Conservative Party does the right things. And that's what we're trying to urge in this report. A lot of people say we're going to do a deal with reform. That is a bad idea. Appealing to reform voters or Liberal Democrats, that's not the case. You need to appeal to them both at the same time. And as James said, ultimately, yes, you do need to win back Labour defectors, but that's something of a second order from where we are now. So when we think about how the next few years of politics are going to pan out, what we think the next year of the opposition should do is pretty clear. And it was on one of the second last slides there about immigration, about tax cuts for low and income earners, but above all, trust and competence. And that is the theme, I think, of Breaking Blue throughout, that voters lost trust and competence in the Conservatives. Winning back from opposition is going to be really hard because we're not in government. There's no levers to pull to do that. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to Grant. And first of all, it'd be great to have your reflections from your election campaign and how that echoes what you see here and what you felt, but also where you think things should go next.
Well, Sebastian, thanks very much for the invite and congratulations on the report. It's incredibly detailed and really, really interesting. I think, let me ask a question here. Who was at the 1997 party conference in Blackpool? Hands up. So this is after we'd lost to Blair. I'd been a parliamentary candidate that year in the not-so-hopeful North Southwark and Bermondsey constituency. I scored 2,855 votes, but I kept my 5% vote share and didn't lose the deposit. But went to a conference where we'd been categorically defeated. And it's fascinating. I'm the only person in this room who was at that conference. It either means I'm ancient or you guys, you found someone else, ancient here, right? But look, the interesting thing was I was driving up there, and it must have been the equivalent of what's that late night Radio 4, the World Tonight programme, and they were doing the front pages of the morning papers at the time, and they did the Sun front page. Anyone remember? This is historic stuff, but the front page of the Sun was the Dead Parrot sketch. And it was, is this a dead party? Can it ever recover again? Remember this. Today, and what we're facing, as this report says, is the worst in history. In some ways, it's far worse than 97. On the other hand, it's also far better than 97. Apart from our party being declared dead on arrival at conference, the other fact of that conference season, just a few months after that year's general election, was Blair had an opinion poll rating, or an approval rating, of 92%. Now, did anyone catch Keir Starmer's approval rating last week as it crashed through the floor? So I think 97 was, in some ways, much better, in other ways, much worse. It goes to prove something that you found in your polling, which is it's perfectly possible for everybody, politicians, but also the public, to believe two simultaneous things which can be completely contrary. And that's basically where my head is. That means that from here, things can either get a lot better, we can cash in on the fact that Labour have shown they're pretty incompetent in leadership, hypocrites, or things can get much worse. We can fail to learn the lesson of this election, spend more time beating ourselves up. I'm actually hugely impressed by the 124 graphs and tables. But actually, I think they all boil down to one thing. And the one thing is, people will not vote for divided parties. It is, if there is a first rule of being a whip, then it is learn to count. Good advice for all the leadership campaigns. If there's a first rule of politics, it's do not be publicly divided. And as I said at my concession speech, to reflect on that for a moment, I found that on door after door, people simply said to me, if you guys can't agree with each other, then we can't agree to vote for you as a party. And actually, that sentiment really sums up what underlies that data and that information. So I think that there is a route back. It's definitely not guaranteed, but it starts with a sense of unity and purpose that actually, beyond that, will allow people to come back and support us in lots of different ways. My final reflection for the second is this. When you ask people about politics and politicians, they'll say, oh no, I don't like such and such. And that's often their first response. I'm really not keen on such and such. I don't like this party. I don't like this individual. And then you have to probe them, and they'll come up with a reason. It's long since occurred to me that people decide that they do or don't like you a long time before they make up the reason to go along and justify their rational thinking to dislike you. It's the same with a political party. If you can demonstrate you have purpose, you're deliberate in action, you're unified in delivery, then they'll actually decide that it's your policies that are persuading them for why they like you. And that is one of the things I think we need to replicate.
Absolutely. I think, and that point about just what the Conservative Party is about as an institution is something that's going to have to be redefined. And in some ways, to Tom's point as well, about the fact that we've had this loss does mean you can start again, and there is going to be a new leader. And in some respect, all four of the contenders have had different levels of public perception and are able to kind of do a bit of a clean break there. Katie, you came at this from a very different perspective as your first election when you were elected in the new Weald of Kent constituency, so which I think has one of the biggest Conservative majorities in the country, obviously all thanks to your campaigning. But what was your reflections on the election and the themes that we're seeing here from people who didn't vote Conservative in your patch?
So I think even from people who did vote Conservative, I think it's, Grant will know a lot more about this than I do, but it's the classic thing in campaigning is people say to you, oh, you know, I voted Conservative all my life, but this time I'm not going to vote for you and this is why. And most of the time, that's not really true. You know, people have left earlier or they've never really voted Conservative or they basically just want to get your attention. What happened this election that was very, very painful, both as a candidate, but also just as somebody who's been a member of the Conservative Party since I was a teenager and a Conservative my whole life, is it really was true. People who really had voted for us for a long time, members of the party even, were saying either I cannot bring myself to vote for you, or I will hold my nose and vote for you, but I don't like it, or I'll vote for you individually, but I don't like that I'm voting for this party. And if we are still in that position by the next election, it will be a complete, you know, it says in the report, we're at an existential point, and I think that that's true. And unfortunately, it could get worse. You know, the Labour government, I think, is off to a spectacularly bad start, but that doesn't mean that people will automatically return to us. I think some of the quotes that Tom put up earlier were helpful in thinking about that, is the more natural thing might be actually for people just to turn off politics and politicians completely. So it's going to be work. We are going to have to work very hard to win these people back because we have managed to turn them off so comprehensively. And if we get it wrong, the Conservative Party has no divine right to exist. It has no divine right to the votes of right and centre-right leaning people. So we should appreciate quite how bad the situation is and use that to motivate us to get better, to improve, and to do better and to be better for the people who continue to put their faith in us. It's also worth saying that return to power is, of course, not an end in itself. You know, the reason that you want to win is because you want to govern. You want to change the country and make things better. Governing is very hard, as the Labour Party is now discovering. It is harder than it looks. And it's only by thrashing out now, in opposition, exactly what it is that we're going to do when I hope, we get back to government one day, that we will, when we get there, withstand the distractions from the thousands of urgent problems that the government has to tackle every day. I also think it's the specificity that will help us win back some credibility. We shouldn't be doing this now. You know, there's no point in taking these policies out to the country now because nobody is listening and essentially nobody cares. But we will have to do it in advance, and then we'll have to be consistent. So I think specificity and consistency are very important to win back a lot of the credibility that we've lost. It should also give us a chance to thrash through these thornier issues that were mentioned earlier within the family, so to speak, and not on question time or wherever it might be. Looking towards the future and what we should therefore do now, I think we have to have a vision. What is our land of milk and honey? Where do we want to take this great country? And that has to be something worth fighting for, that people can feel excited about, that people can feel good about going into a voting booth and putting a cross next to the Conservative Party logo. It should be something that people want to deliver leaflets for and tell their neighbours about. And I think that vision also has to be a moral mission. You know, I think this report correctly talks about really needing to win people back in the 50 to 64 bracket, but there's also a lot of discussion about how we might want to win younger voters as our kind of stage two. And I think a big part of that will be having something that is morally compelling. You know, this is not a managerial exercise, and it shouldn't feel like one. It has to be about what we believe in our heart and in our guts. So we have to persuade people, I think, that nothing will ever work whilst the state remains this size. You know, I think we've really failed to make the moral argument for a smaller state. And, you know, we know, I imagine most of the people in this room will be committed to lower taxes, but the big ideas behind that, you know, freedom, things actually working, are points that we're going to need to make afresh to the public and persuasively. We will need to kind of keep thinking and talking about this and working through it together. But I do think, echoing some of the suggestions in the report, there's a couple of other things that we will have to do. We will need a new approach on border security, sovereignty and migration, and it will have to be credible. There are far too many terrorists walking the streets of Britain because they couldn't be deported. There are also far too many businesses and academic institutions who say to me that they couldn't bring over, you know, scientists and leading physicists because of the bureaucracy of the migration system. Those two things happening at the same time especially mean that something is really, really wrong. We have to work out the migration system that Britain needs, the specifics of how we'll implement it, and then we have to fight and fight and fight until we have it. And I think we also will need to establish a different relationship with and set of ideas for our public services. Public sector productivity is lower today than it was 20 years ago. Most people will say to you, whatever interaction it is they have with whatever arm of the state, it just doesn't work very well. And it cannot be the case that taxes will have to head up and up and up forever to keep our public services above water. So I think we'll need to spend real time in our schools, in our hospitals, with our police forces, again, to come back to my earlier theme, working out specifically what needs to be done. And then on reputation, I spoke about credibility and specificity. I think it's also about communication. We need to speak simply, honestly, with the courage of our convictions and with humility. You know, the public has told us, not you. And if we seem like we haven't heard that message, there is no way back. That's the only way, I think, for us to rebuild trust.
Thank you very much, Katie. Grant, I want to come back to this point about unity you've talked about. And again, it's a clear theme throughout the report about what we need to do. But how do you convince people of that? Because obviously the party was very united in 2019 when Boris Johnson's Get Brexit Done message wasn't just appealing to Brexiters, it appealed to Remainers as well. So that was a very clever example of a policy and a strategy that brought people together. Now, I think the areas that Katie mentioned are very key about having a serious plan for crime, a serious plan for making the moral case for a smaller state. But if you were to imagine the kind of first couple of years of what opposition are going to look like, what sort of things would you be recommending to the next leader to deliver those things?
Well, first of all, I don't think that the next couple of years is the time to come out with a policy platform for an election in 2029. It's a big mistake to do that. I think what we need to do for the next couple of years is stabilise our own position. And the other thing is, as I mentioned before, people don't actually, by and large, normal people don't think about politics at all. And then when they do, they don't think about it in terms of policy. They think in terms of who they like and who they don't like, as I was explaining or mentioning before. So what's the right strategy? Well, first of all, just convince people that you are decent, hard-working, competent, and that you would be the same in government. I discovered, having occupied more cabinet posts than anyone, I looked it up the other day, since Jim Callaghan, even I don't remember governing. And actually what I discovered going through all those cabinet roles is the basic tenet was you've just got to be competent at what you do. And if you're not competent at the job itself, then why the hell should anyone ever put you in that post? Why would anyone do that? And so you can think about all these very fancy ideas, fantastic policies, and the rest of it, but unless people think that you're going to come in as a government and be competent at governing the country, then you don't even pass the test that says we're even going to bother to listen to your crazy ideas. So, the very, very first thing we have to do is to look and feel a lot more competent than we did whilst we were, particularly in those last few years, 2 years. Okay, I did a test before. Who was here 2 years ago at the party conference? Here.
Yeah.
Remember that? There's not that many people. Put your hands up again. Who was here? Oh, no, okay, people.
Yeah.
I mean, that was the craziest conference, right? We'd had this mini budget. The whole thing was falling apart. The government only had a few days left in it. I was a backbencher, and a few days later I was Home Secretary. And a few days after that, the whole government had collapsed. I mean, it was crazy. Why would anyone think that we were, or are, the party to govern if that's the sort of leadership we show? we can demonstrate a lot in opposition. And I think Keir Starmer did a very, very good job of somehow convincing people that he was completely the opposite to the chaos that was Jeremy Corbyn. And he did that through a number of different things as leader of the opposition and the way that he managed his party, and then used that as the backdrop to say, we have changed, now we're going to change the country. The fact that he failed to actually put a programme in place to do anything with the country is, in itself tragic in that sense. But it actually reminded me a lot of the 2005-10 programme by David Cameron. There weren't any policies for the first 2 years, just to the point where it was starting to get quite awkward because we had no policies. But he said, no, let's go. And then he said, I've changed the party, and now I can change the country. And I think that sets out a broad theme.
James, do you want to just come back in on this point as well about what the next leaders should be doing and what opposition should feel like? Because Grant's obviously right. If, think tanks like Onward, if we spent the next 6 months having a fully worked up, costed, deliverable policy on immigration, by 2028, 2029, everyone will have forgotten it. So learning how to do opposition well is something that's going to be quite tough while trying to rebuild that public reputation.
Yeah, so I think from a polling perspective, a couple of things. The first is I think the party needs to look normal again. One of the most telling political polls I think that was run was whether you would have trusted a political party with looking after your kids. And I think the Conservative Party was trailing quite badly by the time it was kicked out of government. And I think just looking like a serious group of people that are able to execute their job is must be a prerequisite. And I think it's been quite a long time since the Conservative Party has even looked like that. So that would be kind of point number one. Point number two is this: how do you do that? And here's the tricky bit: how do you do that whilst you work out what you're for? And this is where it's going to be really tricky, because the Conservative Party is going to have to not necessarily indulge in being even more divisive and looking even more esoteric and strange, but at the same time, it's going to have a very existential discussion about what are its values, what are its view on the economy, on social issues, and effectively hash that out so that it has something to say. And I think for me, that's actually going to be the biggest test of the next couple of years. Now, the worst case scenario is that it has all the divisiveness of working out what it's for, but then left none the wiser, and then goes to the country, again, looking even stranger, with a message that doesn't work. That's the worst case.
Is that the 2001 election, essentially?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. 2001 election, only 8 seats changed hands, and the Labour Party lost to more than 2%. And it's one of those things, if the country don't think that you're ready to govern, voting intention is an output, not an input. If the country look at a party, they don't understand what it's for, they don't like them, and they don't trust them, which is a really bad trifecta to be in, then you simply don't get to govern. It kind of doesn't matter what the vote share is, and we've kind of proven that out with the most recent election outcome.
Tom, do you have any reflection before we open this up to questions?
Yeah, I would just look. I think it's for others to say exactly what the new leader would do, but just from a polling and focus group perspective, I think Labour are in some ways, perhaps by accident, setting a huge bear trap here for the Conservatives, because the new leader will come in on a wave of enthusiasm with a Labour Party that has suffered in the polls, with a leader who is suffering in the polls, and the terrible temptation is to just go at it and fight them. And I think that's kind of the Ed Miliband 2015 problem, which is you then get to the next election, it all looks quite good, but you haven't convinced the voters that you're a different party, that you listened to what they said at the last election and changed. So that would just be my warning to the new leader.
Absolutely agree with that. Katie, you just want to come back?
I was just going to say, I think it's also worth saying on this policies point that I think we're still going through, I don't know what stage of grief we'd currently be at, but I think we are still coming to terms with the fact that we are actually not in government. And so we don't get to make the weather. And so we can't yet be specific about what we will do in 2028, 2029, because we don't know what we're going to inherit. The Labour Party has a long time to do a lot of work between now and then. And what our pitch will be is going to have to, ideally not be reactive to that. Ideally, we'd kind of set out our own stall, but it's going to have to bear that in mind, whatever's happened in the interim.
Great. Let's open this up out to questions. We've got some lovely folks from Onward who've got their hands up. We'll take them in a couple of bunches. Can we come down the front here? Can I take this gentleman here and this gentleman here, please? Just say quickly who you are. And at all Onward events, please questions, not statements.
Simon Whiteley from Poplar and Limehouse. Grant, I'd like to see you back in Parliament, but I'm looking at the results for Welling and Hatfield. If you assume that Reform UK voters voted Tory, you'd be back in. You've got to neutralise Reform. Either they don't stand or you absorb them.
Yeah, thank you. And the gentleman here.
Hi there. My name's Dominic. I'm a councillor in Crawley. Although this question is more about the UK, as 4 nations, I guess, because I'm just wondering. I confess I haven't read the whole report and looked at every graph, so it may be in here. But were there any differences between England, Scotland, and Wales, and I guess Northern Ireland, in terms of the the results? Because obviously we have, especially the Welsh, proportional elections in a couple of years, and I guess it's a real threat that Reform could overtake us and push us into 3rd, 4th, and that would create a bad narrative about who is the kind of natural party of the centre right if Reform overtook us there.
Those questions go very well together, Grant. So this thing about Reform is the fact that we've got actually local elections next year in May 2025, and Nigel Farage has made very clear he's trying to professionalise Reform and create branches and make it a proper party structure. And I guess if they start to get a foothold in local government next May, then what Simon was saying here, you could see elsewhere, that once they're stuck in there, it'll make it even harder for us to come back.
Yeah, I mean, the simple answer to Simon's question is yes, I probably would have won if Reform weren't standing. That's true, but it's not quite as simple as that's because everyone who voted Reform believed in the Reform programme. In fact, most of the people, when I actually asked them, didn't have the first clue what Reform were standing for. It's not the policy, it was our bad that made them look like a plausible option. So actually the same things drove people to vote Lib Dem as vote. I mean, it sounds weird to say because they're politically, we know, because we're all political geeks in this room. But the same thing that drove people to vote Lib Dem is the same thing that voted them to reform, and that's they just didn't want to vote for us. And so, being better as a party, being that competence that I was talking about before, that is actually the building block of it all. But it doesn't go far enough. That's not gonna finish off the job. But we have been here in some ways before. I was party chairman when UKIP were the power of the land. And I used to go, I remember once, by the way, we received 9% of the vote. The UKIP won the set of elections. Anyone remember which? 2014 European elections. I was party chairman, sent out on the media round to explain why the party of government had just received just 9% of the popular vote. They were picking up local council candidates. They had actually a large segment. And actually, if you remember, actually before that, the BNP, was it, were doing very well at local level for a number of years. And then sort of we managed to get beyond that. The reality is that we have, as the Conservative Party, I think, the single greatest built-in advantage of any political party in the world. And that is that we represent, in Britain, the main core, the mainstay of where the British public are. If you want to know where the British public are, they are basically somewhere just right of centre, practical, realistic, want a smaller state, want to pay lower taxes. They're not radical about it. It just doesn't mean that you have to shrink every single thing down to its minimum size as far as the state's concerned. But we basically represent that hard-working families who want to see less state. For Labour to win, they have to move on to our territory, or rather pretend to. And that's what Starmer did. It's definitely what Blair did. For us to win, we've just got to be ourselves. And if we do that, we'll push reform away, and we'll push people away from voting Lib Dems. We've done all this before. I was the party chairman in 2015 when we won that outright majority, and we crushed the Liberal Democrats, not by obsessing about them, but by hugging their voters so tight, we basically constricted their breathing. Not the voters, that is, but Nick Clegg's for sure.
James, is there anything on this gentleman's question just about the differences in the 4 nations? Or 3 nations, I should say.
Well, I think one of the most curious aspects of the general election outcome was the performance of Reform in Scotland. And in many ways, Reform is obviously the predecessor of UKIP. It's about 2 points higher than UKIP got in 2015. But one of the most extraordinary outperformances was in Scotland. Nigel Farage got nowhere in Scotland in 2015 and had a big breakthrough actually in 2024. So it's not just the assembly elections in in Wales, where they pose a massive challenge. And remember, you talk about two parties of the right. Plaid actually are a semi-left, semi-right-wing party in Wales. If you look at the structural areas that they hold in North Wales and Carmarthenshire and the values of their voters and where they voted on Brexit, they actually sit equidistant between left and right. So the Welsh system is primed for extreme fragmentation, and that might be a bit of a shot for where our politics is going. Because, you know, at Labour conferences, there were very similar panels, but all about the discussion of on the left and the fact that the left is also fragmenting in every direction. And we just live in a time of deep dissatisfaction, you know, high cost of living, high inflation, democratic dissent is quite high. We have a party political system that can't quite cope with the diversity of political parties that exist. So it's going to be interesting to see where we head.
Thank you. We'll get some more questions in. And two more this side. Can I get William here and then Kieran there? Thank you. It's just on the front row here, and then gentleman here as well. Thank you.
Hello, William from Conhome. Yes, just sort of following on to that point. I mean, how much further, really, at the next election does the Conservative Party have to fall? Because quite frankly, I cheered when the exit poll came through because I assumed we'd be on double figures in terms of seats. And it strikes me that the natural consequence of us failing in government and Labour failing in government is not that we come bouncing back in 2029, but Reform, another party, actually has a sort of record chance to break through. And so, I mean, quite frankly, if people were mad enough to vote for us this time round after the sort of appalling state of the last 5 years, I mean, just how potentially, I mean, how much further is there for us to fall, basically, at the next election? I mean, that's just what I'm interested in.
And then Kieran here. Niall's just here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Kieran Stacey from The Guardian. I was interested in your analysis of the top three things that 2015, 2017, 2019 Tories think went wrong. I think number one and number two were migration, and number three was getting rid of Boris. Does that mean that talking a lot about migration and bringing Boris back into the fold is a winning strategy for the next election?
Oh, very good. Right. Tom, do you want to take William's question about the floor and things can only get worse?
Yeah, I think when we were drafting the press release for this report, we put our brains together and we were like, well, of course the party can come back in 5 years, and that's what the report shows. But also, the other option is extinction, and I think, none of us should shy away from that fact. Modern political parties have absolutely no right to exist, and the public, it is hard to understate how furious the public are with the status quo and politicians generally. And if that anger is harnessed by reform, as it was in the last election, that is a very dangerous force. But it's for the Conservative Party to offer alternatives, to harness that feeling itself, to say, look, the Conservatives offer a change to the status quo and an alternative to this kind of business as usual. And that's why it's so important to have that clean break with the past and to talk about what happened and to kind of hold your hands up and say, almost a kind of mea culpa for what came before. But, the floor is zero. The floor is zero.
Katie.
So if I sort of understood what you're saying correctly, you're basically saying if somebody voted for us in 2024, what could finally make them desert us in the future? But I think if it doesn't seem like the Conservatives remain a credible national party who could go back into being in government, I think even that 23.7% of people who've remained with us will eventually lose patience. I don't think that we can kind of bank those and assume that we're only going to grow, because whether it's Reform or Lib Dems, I think they're the most obvious two places for those people to go. If it feels like the whole political culture is shifting such that actually we're going to have more parties, maybe we would move to a more kind of coalition-likely system, even within first past the post, whatever it might be, all of those things, if they become too much of a negative spiral, could contribute to the death knell for the Conservative Party. I don't think that we should be too confident that we've hit the bottom.
And Grant, to Kieran's question, so essentially bring back Boris Johnson, solve immigration, and that'll fix it all.
Just before I come to Kieran, if I can just address William as well. I mean, clearly there's further to fall from the percentage we got. But if I was going to put money on it, I think we're going to go back up again the next time round. And I'll tell you for why. Although it was a really disastrous result, as the Conservatives Together report that you flagged at the beginning will reveal on Tuesday, we had a deep dive into the quantitative data, and actually if just 1% of, albeit the right voters, who are registered but didn't vote for us, voted, it would be a hung parliament, and 2% gives us a majority. So this kind of idea that we're a zillion miles from power and it's impossible to get back, I reject, without thinking that means it necessarily automatically happens. The other thing is, just going back to the previous answer, although people voted reform, for example, it didn't mean that they believed in reform. In fact, a lot of them said, I know they're complete nutters. I mean, the candidate in my area was in the newspapers for having said something really stupid about Hitler. Although, it didn't matter. People didn't care. That wasn't the point. The point was, we're not voting for you guys this time. This is going to be your punishment. So back to what we were saying before, presenting competence and being competent, and a new leader getting that will help a huge amount. Without, as Katie says, we have no absolute right to govern this country, but there's so much potential upside just by being competent that you've got to think that there's space for us to be in that position. And on Kieran's specific point, I wouldn't spend the next 5 years banging on only about immigration. You do have to have a proper plan to fix it. I mean, so you've got to have a serious plan to fix it, demonstrably good, and that you would deliver with competence. I hope using quite a lot of the experience of what didn't work in this previous period. But then I wouldn't spend every single day banging on about it. It is a mistake to chase opinion polls, because it's it's one thing to get a number. It's another thing to understand and interpret what you're being told by that number. And so it's always a mistake to chase it. And as for Boris, we've seen actually Boris in the party. It's worked very well in the period from 2010 to 15, when I was first 5 to 15, when I was first in Parliament, in opposition, and then in government. Boris was a net plus, never without complications. There was always a Boris Day at conference when he'd turn up. Huge amount of behind-the-scenes preparation for his arrival, because it would hijack the moment of arrival. A lot of time spent trying to work out which train he was on, so we could manage it. But actually, it was still a net benefit to Conservatives. We won votes. And so I'm very, very much in favour of all Conservatives coalescing and being in this party, not outside of it.
Great, we'll get some more questions in. Could we get the lady at the back and then the gentleman beside her as well? And then we'll come over to this side of the room, I promise, after this. Don't worry. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ellie from Warwick and Leamington and Data Hack. So this is super interesting. Thank you. On the kind of super demographics, and I totally understand the kind of process of trying to win back those voters, but one of those points said, I think it said 66 to 75 age group. And that is a real concern for me, that we are not appealing to a younger demographic of voter under the age of 50, 40, something like that. So to the research people, is there anything in the data that talked about younger voters and what they want? And to the politicians, any other thoughts on that, please?
Thank you. And then gentleman just beside as well.
Hi, George Eaton, New Statesman. I have a question for James. There's quite a lot of polling evidence that voters like policies such as public ownership, higher taxes on the rich, better funded public services, greater workers' rights. What does that mean in the context of the Conservatives' electoral challenges?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Also, great New Statesman-ish question there. Do you want to take that one first, James? And then we'll just get a survey on the kind of below the age of 66 question.
Yeah, nice, easy question. Thanks, George. So actually, there is a clear answer on this, which is that politics is thermostatic. What does that mean in plain English? It basically moves in the opposite direction to whoever's in government. So we've had 14 years of Conservative government, and the country's economic views have shifted substantially to the left over that time. I wrote a report in 2017 with a certain gentleman called Matthew Elliott about the new economy and the views that people had, and what we found is exactly what you've just said, massive support for structurally quite left-wing views on the economy. I expect that all to unravel quite quickly over the next 4 to 5 years, because politics is thermostatic. We've got a Labour government with a massive majority. The second thing is I think Conservative thinking is quite confused at the minute. So one of the slides that we had was this belief in lower taxes but better public services, higher productivity, but also all sorts of cakeism. That's a legacy of, I don't think, being upfront with people and being really clear about the trade-offs that are available. And I think conservative thinking, actually, when you look underneath it, conservative voters are quite confused, both in their own views and where they see the party. So I think there's an ability there to shape, and I think it's going to be very path dependent on who is leader, if that answers that.
I agree in that as well. And to this point about the economy, I think, without being too critical, over the past 14 years, the Conservatives have not done a good enough job of explaining why you need to reform the state, not just put more money into it. Up in 2005 to 2010, David Cameron had a very cogent narrative about universal credit, about devolution, about the NHS, a bit less successful, but he had a kind of clear set of thinking about how you improve the capacity of the state without just putting more money into it. Whereas I think over the last couple of years, we have fallen into the trap of just pulling out the credit card every single time there's a demand or something needs to be fixed. And part of that was the pandemic, because Conservatives have spent 30 years saying to voters, the state can't do everything, and the state did do everything. People lived through it for a long period of time, and without saying to people, hang on a minute, this has burdened us with massive debt, and this is going to create things we need to solve on the other side. So I totally agree with James that whoever is the next leader is going to have to craft a new economic message that acknowledges our demographic pressures, that it's not going to be easy to reduce the tax burden, but needs that clarity between what happened when we were in government and what happened where we are now. Just quickly on that and the younger person point, Katie.
Sure. So I think I sort of slightly touched on this in what I was saying, but I think that the two things that will appeal to all demographics are a much more moral mission and basic competence, which we've talked about quite a bit. I do think a moral mission is particularly important for younger voters. There's a knot made of kind of whether that's millennials or Gen Z and snowflakes, but actually I think that there is a really admirable element of wanting to feel kind of morally fulfilled in the younger generations, and I think if we can't put that across, then we won't even get out of the gate.
Grant.
So somebody in the Conservatives Together, or CTOG, report provided a quote, which I think I'm right in saying they actually attribute themselves, as one of our candidates, attribute to Onward. So I'm just going to read the quote, because it the point about the age demographic, 66-75. This particular candidate told us, a large proportion of my voters who did stick with me this time round definitely won't next time. Not because they perceive we're going to be more divided. You know where this is going, don't you?
Yeah.
More divided than they were before. Or because they think we'll be incompetent, but simply because they'll be dead. And this is a real issue forever for the Conservative Party. At some point, and I wasn't at this conference, but William Hague stood up and did his speech when he was 16. It's all right for you lot. Half of you won't be here in 20 years, but I will. It was as true then as it is now that we need to recruit young people. What to do about it? Well, we had this crazy situation where the party actually decided, as a deliberate point, to avoid going on a particular social media platform, even though we knew that it was the most popular social media platform with, say, people under 30 years old. What kind of party deliberately ignores its voters and then expects to win? It's completely insane. And those are some of the things that we're going to have to work out and sort out. Otherwise, we'll always be in opposition.
I'm really looking forward to seeing your TikTok presence.
It's already there. In fact, I was the only cabinet minister who stuck with it all the way through. It's really simple. You just don't put it on your phone. But don't ignore your voters. Not that it helped me win, by the way. I mean,
We have to make this very, very quick, so we're running out of time, but I haven't done anything this side. Can we just get these two gentlemen here and make your questions super quick and targeted to get through them?
Thank you. Shannon Mediworker. I'm Hornsey and Frian Barnett. On the moral mission point and making that attractive to young people, is there some thinking to do about putting a message forward about expanding economic opportunity to younger people? Is that something we should think about going forward?
Thank you.
I think we're being too nice. We had a leader who was liked, and I know I'm talking about Boris. If you look at the data here, it's very clear. When he was killed or kicked out, the party went down. Sunak, most people, when you talked on the door, didn't think he was so awful. But it was a complete failure, and yet we're not talking about personality. And I think we do need to talk about the personality and what it was about Sunak's reign that completely lost support.
Thank you. Tom, do you want to take those, and then we'll wrap up with James?
So that's a really difficult one. Look, if you sat through these focus groups that we did for this report, you would see that the damage was done during the pandemic and during that Partygate period, and subsequently the mini budget that we talked about were absolutely catastrophic. Rishi Sunak then inherited the cost of living crisis, which was a kind of final nail in the coffin and stifled any possible recovery. But the damage was really done before that. And so, that's all I would say. It is just that damage was already done by that point.
And Katie, you want to come in on the
just on the moral mission question? So, I mean, the short answer is yes. We will definitely have to have something compelling about expanding opportunity for young people, but it will have to be in a conservative voice and with a conservative flavour. So it will need to be about freedom, allowing people to succeed for themselves, the government getting out of people's way, rather than this is what the government is going to do for you to make your life easier. It will have to be about letting people do things for themselves.
And finally, James.
I've got the absolute hospital pass for the question at a Tory conference about Boris Johnson. So I've got two things to say. First of all, he clearly as a leader had exceptional political communication abilities and ability to reach parts of the electorate that other people didn't have. But his vote share was only 0.7% higher than Theresa May's. And he gained... she would have won 3/4 of the seats that he did if Jeremy Corbyn had had the same vote share. Now, accepted, he was able to paint Jeremy Corbyn as a particular person, but I just think there's a bit of truth there to say. Second of all, the polling makes most clear that people are most angry about net migration, and that went up most under his policies, where net migration was 700,000 people a year.
But, sorry, I mean, half of it was both Ukrainians, which I had a family live with me, and BNOs from Hong Kong. It was migration that people actually called for, and we never ever said to people, hold on, the impact of that will be these next set of figures will look really bad if that's what you care about, and somehow never ever made that point clear enough.
Grant, just from a polling perspective, it's the top of every single question. Yeah. If your kind of point is, we miscommunicated it, I think the point was when David Cameron was first elected, the promise was tens of thousands of people, as opposed to hundreds of thousands. And I think you're talking in the scale of hundreds of thousands. But I guess the question was about Boris Johnson. Is a Boris Johnson-shaped hole in British politics at the minute?
The question is about the culpability of individuals.
Yeah.
And we're all sort of talking as a mass, but it's not just
no.
a mass.
Just very, do you want to wrap this up because we need to bring the event to an end here? So I think the point is saying about personalities versus these kind of structural trends as well.
No, I think so. So just to answer, how much is it about personalities? There's one iron rule left over in British politics and polling, and it's basically that the net leader ratings of the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition basically tell you what the voting intention lead will be at the election. So at this election in 2024, the polls were wrong. Labour was not at 40%, it was at 33.7%. And the one thing that would have told you that was the Keir Starmer net favourability ratings versus Rishi Sunak's. And I think in that regards, that's going to be the key determinant. We talked about Keir Starmer, we talked about the next leader. It's the gap between the two approval ratings, and that's every single election since 1979 that has produced the correct voting intention lead, even when there have been massive polling failures. So, and that's why what's happened with Starmer over the recent last 2-3 weeks matters so much.
Well, and on a final happy note, you'll be pleased to know as a poll this morning, sir, Rishi Sunak is now more popular than Keir Starmer as who you'd like to be your next Prime Minister. So that shows you how useful all these polls are. But I want to say a big thank you very much to everyone on the panel for their time today, to James, to Katie, to Grant, to Tom, if you could please put your hands together for their contributions. And please do enjoy the report. I'd like to make a big shout out to just a handful of people who have worked literally full-time, night and day, all weekends for the past couple of weeks to get this together, including Onward's great Gavin Rice, who is at the back there, and Shivani Menon, who's also at the back as well, who deserve a round of applause for pulling this together. And thank you all very much for coming. And please, before you go, if there's any wine left at the back, it gets removed after this event. So take as much as you want. And we'll see you again for Onward's next event.
Thank you.